So today we are looking at the Battle of Dorylaeum, from the First Crusade. Nicaea has been returned to the Romans, so now they're gonna get into an actual more pitch battle. I think this is the more pitch battle before the Siege of Antioch, so it'll be really cool to kind of see that. And overall, I'm really enjoying this series. Actually, I really like this era, Like, I'm such a huge fan, and yeah, I'm just kind of binging it right now, as you could tell. So we should probably get to it, eh?
Despite the fact that the Crusaders showed their martial prowess and personal courage during the Siege of Nicaea, in the end it was cunning Byzantine diplomacy that won the day. The sack of the ancient city was prevented, the prisoners from the People's Crusade liberated, but the Romans now had to ensure the cohesion of their Latin mercenaries and prevent them from slaughtering the Turkish garrison. The Seljuk defenders were secretly ferried off to Pelicanum, where they met up with the emperor, who gave out gifts to everyone, with additional rewards for those who wished to defect to his side. Alexios spent a fortune ensuring that the interests of the Crusaders aligned with his own, but he simultaneously was sending out a strong message to the Turks that the Byzantines had little to do with the savage Franks, and that anyone who willingly surrendered to him would not only be spared, but generously rewarded. As for the
In a weird way, he's kind of using, he actually said, look at me, I'm better compared to the Crusaders, even kings and generals referring to them as his mercenaries. So Alexios is kind of using this to his advantage through PR, right? Like, look at these guys, it almost kind of puts him at a distance from the Crusaders, while at the same time using them. Like, I'll let you guys handle the fighting. Meanwhile, if you misbehave, I'll also distance myself to make myself look like the better option between the two of us. I don't know. That's just. I keep saying the word shrewd. I don't know what else to say. He's shrewd and intelligent. Like, I really like Alexios. I'm personally a very big fan of the man.
Crusaders themselves, their leaders.
Imagine what he could have done if, he had Anatolia, or better yet, imagine he had been the follow-up to, Basil II. Man, Rome might have had another golden age. Unfortunately, he took power in a bad time, but, again, his genius is making the best out of that situation, but,
Were given gold, jewels, silk cloaks, and horses, while wagons filled with bronze coins were distributed to the infantry and commoners. Despite that, tensions began to rise as the Latins became more suspicious of their generous host. Some were offended by the disparity in the rewards, while others were offended that rewards were given out in the first place, as this was supposed to be a religious movement motivated by faith, not possessions.
Yeah, it's funny how, Alexios kind of started all of this to help the Romans, but obviously, that's not really the goal in a lot of these people. In fact, a lot of these people probably don't even, not even probably, they just don't care to actually help the Romans. So, again, it's all a mess. The best Alexios can do is just get them pointing towards the enemy and get them away from him. Kind of he can't control it, but he can't control them, but he can, sort of push them or nudge them towards a more favorable direction,
And yet the biggest complaint came from the fact that only small groups were allowed in Nicaea to observe and pray in its churches. Before they could depart, Alexios seized his opportunity to address the only major leader who didn't swear an oath to him, Bohemond's nephew, Tancred. The Norman once again refused, and demanded for Alexios to accompany the Crusaders to their next target and to receive a royal tent identical to that of the emperor, proclaiming, "If you wish to dominate, then you must strive to serve." A brawl broke out, but eventually calmer minds prevailed, and Tancred swore the oath, kissed the emperor's hand, and received no gifts.
Yeah, no gifts for you. Yeah, again, the egos, man. Alexios and his ability to just kind of at least keep these guys from completely destroying his territory. I mean, they did plunder on the way to Constantinople and, have their raids, but for the most part, any major, destruction to his cities and whatnot, at least especially important ones like Constantinople and Nicaea, is a feat that should not be underestimated or ignored. Like, you know.
Departure, he stared at Alexios and said, "I deem you worthy of being my enemy and not a friend." The council convened, and the Byzantines laid out a master plan to take over Anatolia. The next major target was naturally Antioch, but there were many smaller fortresses scattered throughout the harsh environment of the region that needed to be secured. Alexios put the imperial army and navy under the command of his brother-in-law, John Ducas, who was tasked with the recovery of the coastal provinces. Seljuk Chaka Bey, who ruled from Smyrna semi-independently from the Sultanate of Rum, still posed a significant threat with his navy, and would prevent any supplies reaching the Crusaders once they made it to Antioch. And while some Latins must have felt abandoned by the emperor, it made no sense for him to join the already giant host, only adding to the logistical issues. Not to mention the risks of Cuman invasions, rebellious generals, or death of the emperor. What if the new ruler wasn't so cooperative with the Crusaders? Once again, the Franks were to be escorted by the trusted general Tatikios, who was extremely loyal to Alexios, and as a Turk himself.
Okay, Tatikios was a household slave who grew up with Alexios and was emancipated for his loyalty and bravery. Okay, that makes sense.
He knew exactly what the steppe riders were capable of. Before departing, Alexios gave them plenty of supplies, as well as precious insight, advising them to send envoys to the Fatimid Caliphate and make an alliance with common enemies. And so, 10 days after Nicaea was taken, June 26, 1097, the Crusaders formed a massive column and set off. One of the leaders, Stefan of Blois, wrote back home to his wife, "I say to you, sweetheart, that from Nicaea we will arrive at Jerusalem in 5 weeks, provided that Antioch does not slow us down." Little did he know, the Franks would venture in the mountainous lands in the midst of the summer heat to face an enemy that vanquished tens of thousands of Romans. To reduce the load on the logistics, the coalition army split in two, with the first force moving ahead with Tatikios and Bohemond, the two imperial agents at the front, accompanied by the contingents of Tancred, Robert of Flanders, and Robert of Normandy, while Godfrey, Baldwin, Stefan, Hugh, and Raymond were 3 days' march behind them. It is very difficult to determine the Crusader force, as there were many non-combatants, many among them women and children. The First Army had around 3,000 knights and 10,000 footmen, which included 2,000 Byzantine infantry, accompanied by at least as many camp followers. The second force was at least twice as large, totaling around 4,500 mounted warriors and 20,000 infantry, with just as many non-combatants. Riders were constantly galloping between the two halves, ensuring a steady flow of information about the route they were taking. And while the vast column crawled towards the crucial site of Dorylaeum, the Seljuks observed their every move from the hilltops. The Seljuk Turks were not alone, as Kilij Arslan managed to convince his rival, the Turkic Danishmends, to put their differences aside and combine their armies for a total force between 10 and 15,000 steppe riders. They were equipped with leather armor and piercing swords, but the greatest tool in their arsenal was the recurve bow, with an effective range of 50 to 60 meters. Combined with their expert riding ability and knowledge of the terrain, this was the deadly combination that crushed the Byzantines in Manzikert, back when Romanos also decided to split his army in two halves. It is important to note that unlike many other nomadic peoples, the Seljuk Turks of Anatolia were stripped of a massive advantage due to the nature of the terrain. Despite controlling the region for over a decade, they couldn't raise enough horses to provide each of their riders with half a dozen remounts, meaning that they had to sacrifice in either speed or endurance.
I see, that's interesting. Okay, so there is a disadvantage with the Turks there. Alright.
In the afternoon of the 30th of June, a few Seljuk scouts were spotted, and the Crusader vanguard made camp and sent a messenger to the Second Army, informing them to be on high alert before continuing their march the next morning. Imagining themselves as a Roman legion, weapons taken up, trumpets sounding, arranged against the enemy in wings, centurions leading cohorts and centuries, standards raised, in an orderly fashion we began to set forth. After crossing a small river, the army entered the junction of two valleys, 45 kilometers from Dorylaeum.
Okay, Latin chroniclers confusingly named the battle after where the Crusaders were headed, not where it occurred, and the name stuck ever since.
The open plain was wide enough for the Seljuk maneuvers, but also allowed them to catch the Crusaders by surprise.
Okay, we've seen this plenty of times. Attacking an enemy army while they're crossing bodies of water, usually really great. We've seen it like in times where Archduke Charles managed to defeat Napoleon, I think in the War of the Fifth Coalition. And there have been plenty of times where this has worked out actually incredibly well, because you attack the enemy when they're vulnerable, when they're not fully mobilized, and it's essentially the decision of dividing and conquering. So attacking now would actually be very smart on the Turks' part.
They couldn't have picked a better spot for an ambush. As soon as the Seljuk force was seen, Bohemond ordered a camp to be constructed by the infantry, picking a spot close to the river, hoping that the marshy ground would give them protection on one flank. In order to buy them some time, he and Robert of Normandy gathered the entire cavalry force of 3,000 knights and charged at Kilij Arslan. The fighting raged for almost an hour, but the light cavalry overwhelmed the Latin nobility, sending them back towards the makeshift camp, where some dug trenches, while the non-combatants and baggage train were directed towards the center. Hundreds of troops that were between the two Crusader armies poured into the battlefield, completely unaware of the ongoing battle, before they were captured or killed. Bohemond and Robert ordered their entire force to dismount and positioned the heavily armored cavalrymen to hold the vanguard and withstand volley after volley. There were no walls, just a mass of people in chain armor in the summer heat, holding together against these circling nomads who tried to pick them off one at a time, screaming and taunting in the hope they would turn their back and flee. One eyewitness reports, "They encircled us on all sides, engaging at close quarters and throwing darts and spears and firing arrows wondrously far and wide. They howled and shrieked and shouted, making a devilish noise in their high voices, crying and shouting like demons." One particular Frankish knight.
Yeah, talk about just like the worst kind of situation, right? Again, the Turks are using their superior mobility and speed, you know, to essentially get the enemy. But you have to give it to the Crusaders. They have discipline, and they don't, if I remember at least from extra histories telling, I think they managed to hold down. So, if I'm remembering correctly, then yeah, the Crusaders' discipline and heroism was definitely on display here in this encounter.
Called Robert of Paris, with a notorious background, was one of the first casualties. Back at Constantinople, he mocked the emperor by sitting on his imperial seat. Instead of punishing him, Alexios invited him for a drink and explained they were allies, advising him to never chase their nomadic common enemy. Overcome by anger, the knight threw himself at the Seljuks after multiple civilians were shot around him. Within moments, his movement was slowed by arrows piercing his armor. Soon he was slashed by a blade in full sight of the rest of the knights, who continued to hold their shields up. Bohemond and Robert were now screaming, ordering their men to hold the line, fully aware that if the lines broke, there would be nowhere to run. At first, women constantly supplied the soldiers with buckets of water from the river, but as the hours dragged on, they also had the role of dragging the dead away from the front. Both duties were—
Again, talk about a bad position. Like, also that Robert guy deserved to die. He was kind of a jerk, so but either way, dang man, just that's the thing though. It's like man, being in this situation would be terrifying. You're completely encircled, and you know that you're being broken essentially as the archers just rain upon you. But you know that you have to hold true, because the moment you break and you just rout, that's it. You're all dead. So it's like, man.
Essential to the survival of everyone inside the camp, but with each passing moment, hope was fading. People and animals alike were crying out, while priests were praying for salvation, when suddenly Kilij Arslan gave the order to attack the camp from every direction, both on horse and on foot. Brutal hand-to-hand combat ensued, with many casualties, including Tancred's brother William. Charge after charge failed to break the Normans, but then suddenly a detachment appeared from the marsh and entered the camp, killing anyone in their path. A band of knights quickly rushed to close the gap and push them back, but the Christians were at the brink. It was then a group of cavalrymen appeared on the horizon. It had now been 5 hours since the first clash between the two armies, but after receiving word
Heck yeah, the cavalry has arrived. Thank goodness. You have to give it to them. Like, this is a really heroic, you know, like, I know when we talk about the Crusades, it's usually always, like, in kind of more in terms of, like, some of the awful things that happened, like, between the murder and the, you know, dysfunction between the medieval, leaders and, you know, the saga of Constantinople. But this was just a really, like, just straight up act of heroism and, like, discipline, and it's really admirable that they managed to hold down this long, you know. Again, it's a really great thing to see.
Godfrey of Bouillon arrived at noon alongside 50 knights and bravely charged against the Seljuks, who halted their attack on the camp and turned on the reinforcements. Not long after, Raymond and Hugh joined the fight, and while Kilij Arslan still had the numerical advantage, the lack of remounts and length of the engagement meant that his army was extremely low on both energy and ammunition. At this point, Tatikios and Beaumont switched from a defensive stance to an offensive one, and as the Crusader cavalry engaged the steppe horsemen for the Battle of Anatolia, another detachment was seen on top of a hill behind the Seljuk line. Bishop Adhemar, who used local guides to outflank the enemy,
Imagine being able to
gave a rousing speech as Provençal troops charged into the enemy camp, plundering the Sultan's tent before setting it all on fire and advancing on the enemy. With enemies on all sides, the Turkic army had no space to execute their masterful maneuvers and had no choice but to flee. The formations held, the reinforcements arrived, and this victory sent ripples through the entire Muslim world. Ibn al-Qalanisi, an Arabic writer, noted, "When news was received of the shameful calamity to the cause of Islam, the anxiety of the people became acute, and their fear and alarm increased. 3,000 nomads perished in the battle, while the Christians lost 4,000 of their own, who were celebrated as martyrs. The plunder of the camp resulted in numerous fine weapons, gold coins, jewels, horses and camels, not to mention much needed grain. Everyone involved played a crucial role, but the man who was celebrated the most was Beaumont of Taranto, who rallied his men to stand their ground and fight. It was his courage and leadership."
Certainly, like, man, he essentially kept them from suffering, like, a break and just being straight up slaughtered. Like, Bohemond really did just... He was great. His leadership was great in that situation, you know?
That prevented another Manzikert. It didn't take long before supernatural elements were infused into the events. Seljuk deserters swore that they had seen 2 horsemen with shimmering weapons and of wondrous appearance riding ahead of our army, menacing the enemy such that they allowed them no opportunity for fighting. Christian chroniclers later wrote that God sent 3 saints, George, Demetrius and Theodore, traditionally connected with the
Yeah, Saint Theodore and Saint George are frequently associated with killing dragons, Saint Demetrius with spearing a gladiator.
Orthodox Church to save the Crusaders from doom. When the army broke camp on July 4th, They observed that the road was littered with dead horses and Seljuks, which they took as evidence of the saints charging after the routed enemy. The further the army moved away from Constantinople, the more biblical elements were infused into their beliefs and actions, the boundaries between both worlds slowly evaporating.
Yeah, as like just the spiritual aspect of things just keeps growing, right? Everyone's just like straight up seeing saints and stuff. It really is just amazing just how this conflict kind of does blur the line between the secular world and the religious world. I think it's a really interesting thing because, you know, usually we kind of keep them separated, but this event, it's like you can't. The religious aspect is so ingrained that it's just like you see how those beliefs just kind of meld together. So I like that little antidote because it kind of goes to show just how everything is seen through a more spiritual perspective, you know, of whether God willed it or not. So I don't know, I think that's just an interesting aspect of the Crusades, you know?
News quickly reached Alexios, who immediately sent out his forces against Chaka. One army moved towards Abydos, while the main force marched up the Meander Valley. At the same time, the Byzantine navy sailed directly towards Smyrna, with Chaka's daughter on board as a gesture of good faith. Unbeknownst to the Byzantines, Chaka had recently fled his capital to meet up with Kilij Arslan, who personally executed him because of a growing mistrust, further destabilizing Western Anatolia. As in every other city, the Seljuks were a minority and couldn't hope to hold out, so they surrendered and a new governor was installed. As one of his first decisions, the new governor summoned a local nomad who was accused of a crime. Fearing for his own life, the desperate man grabbed a knife and stabbed the governor, which led to widespread violence as the sailors still stationed in the city massacred the local populace. Ducas had already moved on to his next target, the city of Ephesus, but when news arrived of what had just occurred at Smyrna, the Seljuks rode out and decided to meet the Romans in open battle. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but eventually Ducas prevailed and took the city with no resistance. Leaderless, defeated, and surrounded by rebellious citizens, the Seljuks were fully aware of the severity of their situation, and city after city surrendered to Alexios. Sardis and Philadelphia quickly followed, but one
Something I always liked about the Romans, especially in the Byzantine era, is simply because, like, while most empires will kind of just lose territory, the Romans, while they lose territory, also have great counterattacks. And like, I was watching a video called like the history of the Byzantine era, of the Byzantine Empire as a map video. And like, even when they're losing, they manage to have these rebounds of fighting back and gaining more territory. So like, this is one of those instances, and it really is just cool to see. The Romans didn't die without fighting. That's something I always kind of admired about their civilization. They didn't go out, like, quietly. And, again, just the way things are going, right? Very well for Alexios here, like, taking at least Western Anatolia back.
A particularly interesting case was that of Laodicea, where according to the Alexiad, Ducas accepted the surrender of the garrison and left it in the hands of the deserters. Based on this, we can conclude that he was short on men who could garrison the nearby fortresses, and that some nomads, including noble families, had adopted a sedentary lifestyle and chose to stay in their newfound homes and serve under Alexios. By the end of 1097, the emperor signed a truce with Kilij Arslan, having regained most of Anatolia, fulfilling the dream of his generation.
Yeah, it is a shame that the Romans have lost at least the majority of Anatolia. Like, they had all of it, now they only really have the west. As we covered from like the Rise of the Ottoman series a little while ago, I don't think they would ever fully have all of Anatolia back, but this is probably the best they could have done. And again, under all of Alexios, so you have to give it to Alexios, man. The guy was great.
But the campaign was far from over. and it didn't take long for the high morale of the Crusaders to evaporate as they made their way across the plateau. Tatikios led the crossing, which took place in mid-July, with temperatures reaching over 30 degrees Celsius. There were no major rivers, and to make matters worse, Kilij Arslan adopted a scorched earth policy, stripping the land of any supplies and burning down useful structures. A week into this tumultuous path, a stream was found, and thousands sprinted towards it.
Yeah, the exact same scenario played out in Alexander's army when they were crossing the Gedorsian desert and found an oasis.
Many drank too much and suffocated, while others were trampled. The first major casualty of this expedition were the horses, a symbol of status and one of the greatest strengths of the Latin army. Western horses were larger than their eastern counterparts and demanded between 30 to 40 liters of water per day. Thousands of pack animals and hunting dogs also died, which meant that the pace at which the army could move was further slowed down. This was the sacrifice the army had to make, according to the Roman High Command, which decided to take the southern route instead of the usual one through Ankara, without even stopping at Amorium. The risky move tricked the Seljuks into thinking that the army was not heading towards Antioch, and would divert back to the coast at any moment. Coupled with
Talk about a stroke of luck, right? I like how, like, yeah, the Seljuks, yeah, that was a interesting mistake that they made.
Their recent victory. This meant that the Crusaders were unopposed and didn't have to worry about ambushes and hit-and-run tactics.
Works out for them. I'm telling you, the fact that this all worked out, at least for the Crusades, you know, of taking Jerusalem and all that, is kind of amazing. You know, it really is. Like, I'm almost like, you can look at some of this and be like, this must be, like, divine intervention helping these guys, you know?
By August, the coalition made it to Antioch in Pisidia and resupplied. But by this point, thousands of soldiers perished. The horses, mules, hunting dogs, and falcons were lost, and two of the major leaders were on the brink of death. Rimor was severely ill and didn't expect to recover, while Godfrey was badly mauled by a bear in a recent hunt.
My goodness. Every time hunting comes up in these videos, something bad is always happening. The first earliest example is like when like Napoleon shot Massena, and then like I think it was a hunt or something. They were doing something like that. But then like we saw with the Ottomans, like several sultans died because of just hunting, and it's like, you know, guys, I'm starting to think hunting. I know that like entertainment value was kind of not high back then, at least compared to now. I think we have more entertainment options, at least safer ones. And like I guess hunting was just something you did for fun, you know. It was a pastime among royalty, and you know, I can't imagine what else they would do, or like also heard of jousting and stuff, but like, yeah, you know, with the amount of people who've caught bodies just hunting, I know Godfrey survives, I think he does, but I'm pretty sure he does, but still, maybe cut out with the hunting, especially if you're that important, like a really high-ranking person, you should be really wary about with the hunting, guys.
The next stop was Iconium, a formidable but abandoned fortress, in which the army was warmly welcomed by its Roman population. At Heraclea, there was finally a hint of resistance, as the Turkic riders set an ambush, but after a short skirmish, they fled the battle. The impact of Dorylaeum was so severe that nobody dared to stand against the knights for long. Instead of making for Cilicia, the army moved north towards Caesarea, then took a month crossing the Taurus Mountains, where the temperatures would drop severely, testing the constitution of the Franks, who were used to a very different climate. The roads were so steep that many knights decided to sell their weapons and armor. Whether this was a good plan or not, it solidifies the idea that even at this point, the shots were called by Alexios and his generals. As the troops advanced, Tatikios and his men rushed forward and liberated any strongholds, urging the citizens to ready their goods for the oncoming crusaders and not to stir any trouble. In the absence of Seljuk authority, Roman and Armenian governors shifted their allegiance towards Constantinople, a step which was essential in case the siege of Antioch was prolonged and supplies were needed to support it. In November 1097, Anselm of Ribemont writes that the army held 200 fortresses and cities, while Stefan of Blois' account mentions 165. It is safe to assume that most of Anatolia was reconquered for the Komnenian dynasty.
At Wells Fargo, we get...
Oh snap. So yeah guys, we're gonna end the video right here, and I'll see you guys tomorrow when we get to Antioch. Bye everyone.